We're going on through Genesis, and our study this time is on Joseph. However, there are a few things. We had a long section we sort of skipped over about Jacob. And so I just wanted to mention a few things. It won't take much time. But I mentioned in that there was the first Aramaic phrase that's found in the Bible is in Genesis 31, verse 47. When Laban caught up with Jacob, when Jacob is trying to take Laban's daughters, his wives, Leah and Rachel, and others to try to take a large troop back to the land of Canaan. Laban didn't hear about it until they had already left. And so he pursued Jacob, and he met him in the 31st chapter of Genesis. And in Genesis, when they met, Laban built an altar. An altar wasn't much. That might sound like a fancy word to us, but it was. They built a heap of stones, a cairn, and they gathered stones and just as a memorial place for them. But in the 31st chapter of Exodus, or of Genesis, verse 37 or 47, it says, "Now Laban called it," and I'm not sure I can pronounce the Aramaic word, Jagar Shahadutha. I think I said that last week. But anyway, the phrase means a heap of stones. It means about the same thing that the word Gilead means, or meant to Jacob. And so it was a memorial. Laban was not to cross that point, and Jacob was not to cross that point, so that they were not to be enemies of each other and meet in battle. And that's the end of Laban, really, that all that we hear about in the book of Genesis. But I mentioned that Aramaic phrase, the first one in the Bible, though there's a verse in Jeremiah, and of course the big place where the Aramaic language appears is in Daniel. There are places too in Ezra where the king writes to the people of Israel back in the land, and he writes in Aramaic, and the Aramaic is reproduced. In Daniel, it's sort of weird because the first chapter of Daniel is in Hebrew, but then chapters 2 through 7, and the narrative portion of Daniel ends with chapter 6, and so that would be a convenient place for it to stop. But the Aramaic goes on through chapter 7, and then after that it's the night visions of Daniel in the rest of the book. But that's the only Aramaic in the Old Testament. It's for the most part written in Hebrew. Of course, I had to take a course in Aramaic simply because there was this small portion. And so we read all of the Aramaic in the Bible, which isn't too much. A few chapters in Daniel, and the rest of the places are just a phrase here and a verse in Jeremiah. But we read a lot besides the Aramaic of the Old Testament. What I call the Elephantine papyri. A number of papyri discovered on an island way up the Nile River. I say up the Nile River, but it's south. And so the island of Elephantine had a colony of Jews. Apparently, they were placed there by the Persian Empire as a sort of guard against the southern extremity of their land. And so the Elephantine community of Jews stayed there, for years, hundreds of years. They had their own temple, which is not exactly according to the law, but there was a community of Jews there. So there's not a great deal of Aramaic in the Old Testament, but there is Aramaic out of the ancient world. It was one of the most common languages in the ancient world. The Chaldean language, actually the language of Mesopotamia, was Aramaic. We should associate Jacob especially with the place of Bethel. When he escaped from Esau, he went north and dwelt in the land of Bethel. In chapter 35, the Bible says that God said to Jacob, "Arise and go to Bethel." And this is the second time that, in 28 is when he first appears in Bethel and has the dream that we know about Jacob's ladder, where there's an ascending and a descending of angels on the ladder where Jacob dreams. But there's more about Bethel said in that context than simply the dream. Jacob, the Bible says, recognized that it was a special place of God. And Bethel was among the Canaanite people. We don't know a lot about Bethel. Archaeologists have worked there. But it was not a very important or big city, but it was a sacred city, held to be sacred by the Canaanite people. El was the chief god of the Canaanites. And so Jacob called it the house of God, where he was. And he supposed that God had appeared to him there, that it was sort of the gate. Well, the Bible says that Jacob saw that it was the gate to heaven. And so it was a special place to Jacob. On the way back to where his father and mother lived in the area of Hebron, Jacob stopped at Bethel again. It says in chapter 35 that then God, the Bible, Elohim, is a plural word, but it's used in the Bible as a singular, talking about the one God of the people of Israel. And so God said to Jacob, "Arise and go to Bethel, and live there, and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." So this is the second time that Jacob has been to Bethel. And so he told his household to put away their household gods. I think that we have to accept, it is said several times in Genesis, that some of the patriarchs were at times idolaters. They had gods, they worshipped the gods of the land. Well, the later Jews were too. They, according to Jeremiah, they worshipped on every high hill where they could set up a shrine to the gods of the Canaanites. It wasn't until the time of Josiah or so, when Josiah found a copy of the law, good King Josiah. He became king when he was just a boy, and he was killed while he was a young man in the Battle of Megiddo. And so Josiah was not a king for a long period of time, but the Bible says that he found a copy of the law. And so the restoration of the land, the keeping of the Passover and all of that, was effected during the time of Josiah. So there seemed to have been a great religious revival during the time of Josiah. Strangely enough, Jeremiah was a contemporary of Josiah, began his prophecy when Josiah was king, but he has hardly anything to say about Josiah or the Reformation that Josiah brought about. So I thought we might point out that Jacob and his family did worship idols. They worshipped idols at various times. It says that Jacob and his household and all who were with him, and there were many besides Leah and Rachel and his children, but they put aside he told them to put away the foreign gods which are among you, and purify yourselves, and change your garments. And so there was a great deal of idolatry that took place during this period of time. In 35 verse 8, there is a mention of Deborah, who is the nurse of Rebekah. She's mentioned nowhere else. But she died while they were in Bethel, and Jacob buried her under a tree there, a sacred tree. And so Deborah may well have accompanied Jacob because she saw it as a chance to see Rebekah once more before she died. She's an old woman, and so she goes with Jacob and his household toward the land of Canaan when they go. But there is a mention made of Deborah's death, and it's the only mention of Deborah is in 35 verse 8. There is a mention earlier of Rebekah's nurse, who accompanied her, the Bible says, when she went back toward the land of Canaan. I don't know if this is the same nurse, if it is Rebekah or Deborah that returned to her brother's house, to Laban's house, or to Laban's father, who was Bethuel. He may have returned there, or she may have returned there. On the other hand, Rebekah may have had more than one nurse, and so one may have accompanied back to the land of Canaan. There is a second mention of Jacob's name being Israel in chapter 35, verse 9. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram, which is the area of northern Mesopotamia. And God blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. Now, the first time that Jacob is named Israel was when he wrestled with the angel or some divine being. Actually, Jacob says that it is God. But the translation, at least that I have, the New American Standard Version, makes the pronouns regularly. The New American Standard Version and many other translations will make the pronoun he and him, will write them with a capital letter or translate them with an uppercase letter whenever they refer to God. Well, a lowercase letter is used of whoever it was that wrestled with Jacob. And so maybe it was an angel, but Jacob calls him God. And he says, God is in this place, and I wrestled with God and prevailed. And so it is, I don't know who wrestled with Jacob, but it does say, and it's in the 28th chapter, I think, or the 29th chapter, that Jacob, my headings, it's not either. But when when he first met Esau, it's in the 32nd chapter. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when Jacob, skipping down to verse 29, and Jacob asked him and said, please tell me your name. But he said, and the he has a lowercase h, he said, so the translators at least did not understand this to be God who was wrestling with Jacob. Why is it that the angel says, or whoever, why is it that you ask my name? And he blessed him there, he blessed Jacob. And Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, I have seen God, face to face. The word Peniel means the face of God. And so the sun rose upon him, on Jacob, just as he crossed over at Peniel, crossed over the Jabbok, and he was limping on his thigh. Therefore, to this day, the sons of Israel do not eat the sinewy of the hip. I think I mentioned that last week, but there is no mention in the law of the people of Israel not eating the sinewy of the hip. That verse sort of stands alone in the Old Testament. And so Rachel, on the way to Hebron, where Jacob's father and mother were, and Isaac and Rebekah. While Jacob was on his way to Hebron in the south of Judea, Rachel has her second child. It's not really clear where they are when the second child is born. She calls him Benoni because the word means son of my sorrow. Is a word that means my in Hebrew. On the cross, Jesus says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So it's the first person pronoun. But the lama sabachthani is the same here as the I. And so she calls the child that is born Benoni, but Jacob renames the child the son of the right hand. And so Benjamin is the only one of Jacob's children that is born away from Mesopotamia, in the land of Canaan, to the south of the land of Canaan. You sort of get the idea that it's somewhere in the area of Bethel. I mean, Bethel has been mentioned all through this account here. But the problem with that is that later on, when Samuel anoints Saul to be king, he is to meet some prophets near Rachel's tomb. Well, that was in the land of Benjamin. You see, he was a Benjamite, Saul was. And so it's where the tomb of Rachel was, where Rachel was buried, is not clear. But Jacob was traveling. He was traveling on the way to his homeland, and no doubt was in something of a hurry, was close enough to the land that he was anxious to get there. And so nothing is said of Rachel's burial. Leah doesn't die until later on, but there is one mention of Leah's death too. In the 49th chapter, verse 31, the death of Leah is mentioned. It's the only time that her death is mentioned. The one other thing that I thought I would mention is that while you remember that Simeon and Levi had killed the men of Shechem when they had agreed to accept circumcision, that Levi and Simeon had gone back, no doubt with some of the slaves that had gone with them, but they killed all the men of Shechem. It may not have been a large city at that time, but Hamor, the father of Shechem, the word Hamor means a donkey, so you can see something of their opinion of Hamor and the other people that lived around Shechem at that time. Of course, there were no Israelites in the land. Jacob was the only Israelite alive, he and his family. And so when they are there, they kill all of the inhabitants of Shechem, and the two brothers, Simeon and Levi, become sort of a pariah to Jacob. He will have nothing to do with them. Well, that brings us to chapter 37 and to Joseph and his dreams. The Bible says that Jacob had a special favoritism. I mean, that's the indication, at least. Had a favoritism toward Joseph. Joseph was the oldest son, was the firstborn of his favored wife, who was Rachel. And so by the King James Version says that he made him a coat of many colors. Well, as far as we know, there was no particular thing of honor attached to having a coat that was made of many colors. And those who are experts on the dyeing of cloth and such as that hardly think that the term probably does not mean a coat of many colors. And so many of the translations will say something on the order of a long coat, or it would be a coat of some way to distinguish him, to make him stand out from his brother, to show the favoritism that Jacob has for the firstborn of his preferred wife, who was Rachel. And so a time comes, and Genesis chapter 37 tells about it, when the flocks that he was a wealthy man, when they needed grass. And it's not too far to the area of Shechem. It's only about 50 miles north from where Jacob lived, and Jacob and his sons, his family, lived. But there's a great deal of difference in the climate there. There's more grass around that area. The land of Canaan itself is not a big land. It's about the size of Vermont. And so it's not a big land at all. Any part that you would be in the land of Canaan would be close to any other part. And so Jacob sends his sons with his flocks up to the north somewhere where they can get some greenery, some food, and to preserve the flock. But they tarry there a long time, and so Jacob sends his youngest son, or his second youngest son, the firstborn of Rachel, Joseph, his favored son, that had stayed home, with no doubt with Benjamin too, since Benjamin would have been much younger than the rest of them. And so the 10 brothers took the flocks of Jacob, of their father, northward, up in the area of Shechem, where there was more greenery. And then Joseph is trying to track them down. Well, they already have a good bit of resentment toward Joseph. Joseph has told them, you would think that if Joseph had a dream that he knew would make everybody mad, that he might just be quiet about it. But he dreamed that while he was out reaping in the field, that his own sheaf stood up straight, and his brothers' sheaves gathered around his sheaf, and all of them worshipped. And so they said, well, does Joseph suppose that we are going to be his servants, and that we will give him obeisance later in his life? Well, of course, that's exactly what happened. After Joseph was taken to the land of Egypt, and Jacob's people had to come to Egypt to get grain, they didn't recognize Joseph at first. And so the first dream that he had was about his sheaf in the field, but that wasn't enough. He dreamed further that there were 11 stars around himself, and that the 11 stars all bowed down and worshipped him, and the sun and the moon, which apparently symbolized Jacob and his wife, or wives. And so there was a lot of resentment already toward Joseph. In fact, the word in Hebrew that means somebody that is a sort of chieftain is Baal. Baal, of course, was chief of the gods for the Canaanites. And so when the brothers see Joseph coming, they call him the Baal, the Lord of the Dreams. That's the way they sort of ridicule him. But on the way, Jacob meets some man in the field a stranger, and no name is given to him. He only occurs here in the Bible as far as we know, but there's this man that shows up, maybe the same man who appeared to Joshua when he came into the land of Canaan. But at any rate, the man tells Joseph where the brothers are, and Joseph sets out in search of them, and they see Joseph coming, and they call him the Lord of the Dreams. And they decide that they'll kill him. The 10 brothers decide that they'll kill him. Maybe there's only 9 involved here. Reuben may not have been involved at this point. But they decide that they'll kill him, cast his body in a pit, take his coat, his long coat, and smear the blood of a goat on it, take it back home, and let Jacob draw what conclusions he wanted to draw. In that day, there were lions in that part of the world. There were Asiatic lions, which I am told, I've never met any of them, understand, but I am told that the lions in Asia were somewhat smaller than the lions in Africa, and there's some trait differences. But the hunting of lions was a favorite sport of many of the kings of the Persians, of the Assyrians, and so forth. And they leave behind many monuments of themselves as a slayer with a spear ready to kill a lion. And of course we know that Daniel was cast into a den of lions. So there were a lot of lions in that part of the world. And Jacob might suppose that his son was killed by a lion or by some other beast. And the brothers intend to be rid of Joseph at that point. Well, Reuben comes along and he says, why do it that way? Why let him, you have to kill him to throw him in a pit. Just put him in a pit, let him die. And Reuben, the Bible says, planned to come back and rescue Joseph. But in the meantime, a caravan of Ishmaelites come by. Now, of course, we know Ishmael, a son of Abraham, the oldest son of Abraham. But Ishmaelites are not mentioned many times in the Bible. They apparently were merchants. They apparently came somewhere from the area of Gilead with merchandise that they wanted to sell in the land of Egypt. And so the brothers say, why don't you buy this slave? Maybe somebody in Egypt would like to buy him. And so you can make a few extra dollars while you're going, or a few extra whatever it is. And so the Ishmaelites took Joseph and went on toward the land of Egypt. And Reuben came back to rescue him from the pit, and he was gone. And but the brothers took the coat of Joseph back to Jacob, and Jacob drew the conclusion that they wanted him to draw, that Joseph had been killed somewhere along the way. They had blood on his coat and the coat that belonged to Joseph. And so that will be where we take up next time, is when Joseph was taken to the land of Egypt, where he was sold and who he was sold to. Of course, we know that his name was Potiphar, and how he prospered in the land of Egypt until Joseph becomes ruler over the whole land, and his dreams proved to be true. But we'll stop there, and we'll take up with Joseph in the land of Egypt next week. Thank you for your attention.